All right, Friday again and time for live stream. Maybe that is a little bit better, and maybe even this will, it won't get prettier than that, I guess. Yeah, so live stream. Week 42 has passed. It came and went really quickly. It's been a busy week for you and for me too. Well, today is the final day to hand in workshop number 2, so I guess you have a few more hours left of work if you want to. So let's take a look at the schedule. I hope everything is working. It seems to be working on my side, but if you think there's a problem or if it's working, please say so in the chat and I can take a note. Anyway, it's 2 weeks left of the course. Today, deadline for workshop number 2. The final hand-in, you hand in Moodle. Don't forget to don't forget to add the README if you're in a group, so that we can know that you have worked together. Otherwise, I think everything should be clear for this hand-in. I will do a short recap of what I said last week about common mistakes later also, so you can take a final check there. Otherwise, of course, the test was on Wednesday, the first chance to pass the test. I think it actually went pretty good. There were no real large technical issues and no real misunderstandings from a lot of people, so that went well. A little bit over 50% passed the test on this first chance, and that's a really good result actually, so well done. The test is not easy and it can be frustrating, of course, but being able to comment is a way for you to at least express what you meant by your answer and have the chance to get a bonus point and at least get some feedback from me on where you were thinking in the wrong direction maybe. So next chance is on the 22nd. So you should all have some feedback in on your comments, and well, you have a new chance again next week. So I think there will be a fair amount of you who will pass that time also. Feel free also to book a tutoring session with me if you have some questions regarding the answers on the test or something like that. It's always better to ask a question and have it explained once too many than once too few, and maybe get some tips on how to think regarding certain aspects of the course. That being said, in the future there is one more deadline to think about, important deadline, so it's workshop number 3. I guess most of you have, or at least a few of you have started the tutoring sessions that I had earlier this week. There were a few sessions regarding workshop number 3, so I will take the opportunity also to talk a little bit about that today. So moving on. Final handed of workshop number 2, as I said, and this is just a recap of what I said last week actually. So please make sure that your class diagram is up to date and it reflects the implementation correctly. You should have all the classes there that you yourself have implemented, all the interfaces, all the enums, abstract classes, whatnot, everything should be there. You should have all the relations, mostly association and dependencies, and these should of course be correct. It's important that you take the time to add the correct multiplicities for the associations, the role name that corresponds to the attribute name, and also the arrow on the association. For now we are talking about design, and then this navigability is important. Some of you may also have interface fulfillment or realization, and some of you will also use inheritance, and then you should use generalization, specialization relationship, of course. Everything of this is explained in the class diagram notation crash course, so please take a look there also. This should be totally clear to you when you hand this in. The sequence diagram, you should show all your calls, i.e. the calls that you make to your own code. So you have a bunch of classes. In the sequence diagram we will use the objects from these classes, and they will send messages, i.e. operations, and you should end this chain where your code ends, so to speak. That's a good way to put it. For example, don't forget to print the member information, for example. In some cases, people forget that the view often gets some information from a member object to print it. It calls getName, getBoats maybe, and loops the boats and things like that. So don't forget that stuff. The idea here is that we want to see that you can construct a class diagram based on source code that is correct regarding the relationships between the classes, and we want you to be able to construct a sequence diagram that exactly corresponds to the code. Sequence diagrams are quite hard actually to do well, and especially if they become large. The tool support is I think a little bit lacking, and sometimes you need to live with some notational quirks of the tools that you use. I will show the tool that I prefer a little bit later, and it also has some quirks. We are not that strict with the exact notation for the sequence diagram, because there will be some tools that are doing things a little bit differently than other tools, so to speak. But for the class diagram, you should have a tool that can do everything correctly, and it's basically boxes and arrows with different arrowheads, so that shouldn't be a problem. Alright, the common problems that we see in submissions that you can check already is that you have some form of view responsibility in the model. That is, you are either directly printing stuff in the model, so the member can print itself, or the boat can print itself, and that's of course a violation to the model view separation principle. The next thing is that some people tend to add formatting of strings in the model, so you call some kind of like get string or get function that compiles a string for printout, and that is also something that we don't want to have in our model classes. Remember that we want the view to be responsible for the layout or the printing of the data. And this is so that we can change the view, we can have multiple views. Maybe one view should be formatted in some other way than the first one. No, persistence is a totally other question, and that should be encapsulated in the model, I would think, and it can be whatever you like. Yeah, toString is sometimes something we see, and I think toString can be great for debugging purposes, but it should not be something that is used for printing in the view, so to speak. And also, as we are not focusing on error handling or things like that, some printing for error handling could also be okay to have in the model, just for error handling stuff, so to speak. So it's not the nicest thing. It's not that hard to cast the exception and let the view print it, but I would probably not say much about that if it's just exception handling, so to speak, catching the exception and printing the call stack and things like that. Could be all right to have in the model for this assignment. The next thing is that sometimes you have model responsibility in the view, and basically this is the unique ID generation or checking of that the ID is unique is sometimes done in the controller and the view, and this is of course something that we want to have in the model, because if we add a second view, we don't want to be need to repeat this functionality. Just to confirm, it is not necessary to show multiplicity on a dependency in UML class diagram. No, the dependency is they don't have multiplicities though. So inherently, the dependency just say that this class is dependent on the other class. It doesn't say anything about more or less how many objects are handled. The association, on the other hand, is that's another thing, because as it's implemented as an attribute, there's quite a difference between having one instance or having to handle many instances when you implement. You need to use an array or a collection class or something like that to handle many. But for dependencies, that doesn't really apply to have multiplicity at all. All right, so well, yeah, be careful about that. And that view responsibility in model and model responsibility in view is sometimes quite hard. Sometimes you really need to think about, is this thing something that is unique for the view, or is it something that we should put in the model? Is it a business requirement, so to speak, or is it just some visualization thing? And of course, hidden dependencies are also quite common. I've alerted you on this issue many times now, but if you have hard-coded constants that need to match between different between different classes, especially if they are between different packages or different architectural modules, then you are in trouble. So watch out for those hard-coded constants. It is okay if they are encapsulated inside the same class, or even better, within the same operation. All right. Well, make your final checks. Make sure everything is all right, and hand it in today before 23:59, and everything should be fine. So I think I got one question regarding the sequence diagram, and maybe we should just take a look at the sequence diagram right now. And I'm using web sequence diagrams. So some people like it, some people don't. I think it's nice to not have to deal with the layout of this mess. It quickly becomes quite hard to work with if you drag and drop and write, and everything can become wonky. So this is what I prefer, but maybe you don't. It's quite a lot of text to write, and there's a syntax to it, and some of the features you need to pay for example, having anonymous calls, but you can probably get by using web sequence diagrams. So this is a diagram for starting a new game, some version of the blackjack game, I think. Probably not the one that you have in the workshop number 3, but basically the objects are the same. I think there's a game facade in between the controller and everything else there also, so it is not exactly as the code you have. If we have a method that is kind of hard to grasp by a quick look, if you write a comment and explain it, that is totally fine. I'm not a big fan of writing a lot of comments. I think using good naming and making sure the code is readable and have nice variable names and so on and so forth is the best way to go. And just repeating the code in a comment is not a good idea. But explaining something that is hard to understand is of course good to do in comments. So if you have some functions like that, comments are appreciated. All right. In sequence diagrams, is it necessary to show w42 list, for example, if objects are stored to retrieved from a list? No, I don't think so. In this assignment, we stop at our own code, so to speak. So you don't need to add any calls to functionality or classes outside the scope of your own code, or send messages to something else that is outside the scope of your own code. And for example, looking at this little diagram here, I think scroll down. Yeah, so this function called %dealer_hand we first get the hand from the dealer, and that returns an iterable of card type. So actually it's probably a call to some array list or something like that, but that is not shown here because that's out of scope for this diagram. So it's not code that I have written myself. So you can stop there also. I think these diagrams would be huge if you put everything in them. So we draw the line at code we have written ourselves. One thing to note here is we have objects on top, object lifeline, and the messages are operation calls. So we call operations on other objects, and the objects communicate, and we have return values. Not always super duper needed to use the return values. For example, if I had the choice, I would not add this one because it doesn't return anything. and also this one doesn't return anything. But I needed that to a quirk of this web sequence diagrams is that we need to specify the return if we want to have these nice little boxes here. Yeah, so nested functions. That is actually, so if function A has an argument that is also computed by function calls. So in this case, function B should be called first, and then function A is called. So you kind of like in the sequence diagram, you unnest the nested sequence of function calls. So that's the way you need to think about that. So the code implementation can be really compact, but it will anyway be two function calls in sequence in the sequence diagram. First function B to compute the argument, and then function A to get the argument. So as you see here, you have objects on top with the type of the object. This is important to remember that we actually almost always show the type. So these are all objects, but we show the type of the object. So an anonymous object of type program, an anonymous object of type controller player, and that's the fully qualified name, because I have also a model player object here. So it can be important to distinguish these if you use the same names in different architectural modules. So we can see the objects, we can see the classes of the objects, we see the messages between the objects in the form of operation calls. We can also actually then see that, well, this controller player needs to have some form of relationship with the dealer class, because a message is supposed to be sent to the dealer class to start a new game. So in the class diagram, we need to have some kind of relationship between these two classes. I think it's safe to say that it will be either be a dependency or an association, but we cannot know which one it is actually by just looking at the sequence diagram. So we can see that there must be a dependency of some form, but we cannot see what type of dependency it actually is. If it's a plain dependency, if it's an association, cannot be seen here. If you have minor issues in our diagram, is it an automatic failure, or will we have a feedback and a chance to fix these issues? Everyone will get a chance to fix any issues. Depending on the severity and amount of issues, you may even pass if you have some issues. Because, well, if we see that you have done association versus dependency correctly in 9 out of 10 places, we will probably just mention that, well, this association should also have a role name, or what minor thing you may have forgotten to add. So, well, we are strict, but not super duper strict. So in general, some mistakes are allowed even for the passing grade, but you will all get a chance to make fixes if you have severe problems, or maybe many small issues that we kind of like would like you to fix. So another quirk of this tool then is that these here we have a call to a method in the same object. So inside start new game, you get a bunch of cards from the dealer, and you give it to the dealer, gives it to the player, and then he gets a new card from the deck, and he gives it to himself, so to speak. To the dealer object gives it to itself, and so this call is back to the same object. And the return arrow here is not that nice, because I would prefer that it wasn't needed at all, but it should at least actually go back to this block here and not to the same block. But yeah. You can have alternatives, and you can have loops. I guess that will be the most common things in your diagrams too. Looping the boats, for example, should probably look something like this. This is looping the cards, but anyway, yeah. Are there any more questions regarding sequence diagrams? So we can take that now. Personally, I don't work that much with sequence diagrams actually. It's when I learned this stuff, we did class diagrams first and used sequence diagrams quite sparingly, and that is in some way ingrained in me. I totally get the point of actually doing it like the book says, the sequence diagram first, because it forces you to focus on the functionality you are supposed to implement right now. If you do class diagrams first, I have a tendency to think a little bit too much about, oh, this needs to be foolproof and future safe, and we should extend it in these 55,000 different ways, and it becomes a little bit over-engineered quite easily. So, as I said before, feel free to start with class diagram, feel free to start with code, feel free to start with sequence diagram. Maybe try different approaches when you develop, and see what you actually like, and what is the most productive way to do this for you. I think many professional developers have so much knowledge in their heads and hands almost, so they don't really think about these patterns and stuff actively. It's just the knowledge is just there. So it's not, if you ask senior developers, for example, it is not sure that they even know what grasp is. So it's more of a structured way to try to teach these things and pass on the knowledge. But then when you get the experience, these things will be more or less automatic for you. Yes, each block on the line represents a method. So for example, this present instruction, the controller player object calls present instructions to the view console, and this is where this operation has focus, so to speak. So it executes and then it returns. And then, oh, I forgot to add the little box there. I wonder why that isn't present, because we have the return arrow. Maybe we can kind of see. So it's that call, and that is the return, and it should be a plus. So I actually fixed all of this just right now before the live stream, so it was a little bit stressful, and that's also why were a little bit late, I guess. 2 minutes. I personally like to use object names. Sometimes this is hard because you can like happen to name the same object different things in different operations, for example, arguments for the operations, and it can be a little bit confusing if you don't have the same naming standard. So that is something to maybe think a little bit about. If you have, say, an e-commerce customer controller, for example, what identifier does the controller use to retrieve information about the customer from the model? UID or something else? Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's well highly, my God, so many events. Highly dependent on kind of like what technologies you use, but in some way you need to identify objects, especially in a distributed system. So the web browser client and the backend needs to know, okay, what object is actually the client manipulating right now, and then there needs to be some form of identifier for this that you can send over the network, and I guess some form of textual representation of an ID is a common standard. So some form of identifier, whether it be a long, unique, globally unique identifier, or maybe a database key or something like that, you generate yourself. So especially for distributed systems, it's important to know the objects that you actually have. If you work on a system that is inside the same memory, so to speak, which is what we work with in the course mostly, and what I recommend you to work with, because it's easier to conceptually grasp. The objects have unique IDs because they are placed somewhere in memory, and this place is not overwritten by something else suddenly. So if we have kind of like work within the same memory address space, so to speak, we don't have this problem because the object will be uniquely identified automatically. All right. Cool. I think we can leave the sequence diagrams for now. We are probably stricter with the class diagram notation than we are with the sequence diagram notation. There are differences in arrows and stuff like that also in the sequence diagram, depending on the type of message, if it's synchronous or asynchronous and things like that. But that's not anything that we use in the course anyway, so you don't need to be alarmed about such things. Alright, workshop 3 is what you are supposed to focus on next, I guess. As I said in the start of the course, this workshop is actually not that large. Workshop number 2 is by far the largest one, with the major work is actually done. Workshop 3 is not really that much to do, but you need to have a solid understanding of things before you can do it. So it's more of a knowledge kind of task than grunt work. That was maybe the focus of workshop number 2. Some questions have come up during the tutoring sessions, and yes, you are allowed to change the code. Some people try to do really tricky solutions to problems that were not that easy, and it's easier to just change the code. So for example, adding a new type of rule requires you to change the dealer class a little bit. You need to add this new rule, and you need to remove some code and move it to this new rule hierarchy instead. The observer implementation will require you to do some changes. Removing the bad hidden dependency, of course, will require some changes. The refactoring will require you to change the code also. So you are allowed to change the code, and it's what you are supposed to do. The observer implementation is sometimes made more complicated by using different types of libraries, for example the Java util observer stuff, and that often confuses you more than helps you. So I think you should write your own implementation for this, and don't use anything else than the basic code that you write yourself. If you go for a higher grade, grade 3 is not that much actually. It's basically using abstract factor in visitor, so it's totally doable in quite a short amount of time. if you get the patterns, you will get the implementation quite quickly also. So it's not that much work really to get to a higher grade for workshop number 3 if you want to. And finally, grade 4 will take some time because then you are supposed to create a new user interface for the using some other paradigm than console-based user interface. And that can take some time depending on how what type of user interface you choose, of course. It does not need to be pretty or something like that, rather demonstrate the principles that you would like to show. Bonus points if you convert it to a multiplayer game using WebSockets, so we can play it on the web. Alright, any questions regarding workshop number 3? Alright, this week I did not have that much time to work on this student administration system. I did manage to add some automatic tests, especially for the validation stuff that I started last week. So I hope to be able to finish this during the week now. But well, workshop number 2 is heading my way now, and there will be approximately 175 submissions is my guess. So there is a large chance that I will not really have the time and energy to spend on coding, even though it's much more fun than checking a lot of class diagrams and boat club code. So I guess this is it for the live stream for today. I don't think I have anything more I want to say right now, but feel free to book some tutoring with me or with my colleagues. We will probably have a little bit less tutoring the next week because, well, we will focus on trying to get some work done on assessing workshop number 2, of course. But there will be some opportunities added later this weekend. Alright, have a nice weekend and don't forget to make the final submission. Bye for now.